Right. Okay. I think we'll make a start. So I think some of you have been to these before, some not. Really good to have you all here. These are Open Data Saves Lives. So we run these about every 6 weeks. This is number 39, it seems incredible. How many we've done since Paul and I kind of cooked this up during COVID. And these ran weekly during COVID because we were sort of desperate to help if we could at pace. And there was a whole load of people during COVID who had done some amazing things with data, who were frankly kind of embarrassing what was going on centrally, scraping a whole load of websites together, creating some fantastic COVID resources. And as we started to come out of COVID, we reduced the pace ever so slightly, but we still found a massive demand for these, which has continued to go up. That has settled, I was saying to our speakers just before, as much as luck by judgment and interest, I guess, into a few specific areas that we're very interested in. And those are things like inequalities. So we've run quite a lot on inequalities, and that'll be very relevant today. So I can see that Jake's on. Jake and I did some analysis of the people waiting to leave hospital because they don't need to be in hospital anymore. Are they picked randomly from the population, or do they tend to go towards people from certain ethnicities, certain socio-demographic backgrounds, and so on? And not surprisingly, there are some patterns in there. So inequalities is a big theme for us. We've also done quite a bit on mental health. We've done some sessions on cancer, which Mike Richards led. And another big area for us, which we hope is what we're creating here, is a kind of, call it a community of practice, if you like, of kind of the analyst body. We are trying to take which is a relatively new profession and help professionalize it quickly. So we're working with people like the Association of Professional Healthcare Analysts. We've done quite a bit with NHSE on their new National Competency Framework, which is basically taking the roles of a lot of what us do, which is being an analyst, and sharing really quickly, sharing publicly, sharing openly, everything up on GitHub. Here's my code, here's the data set that I used. That links into a lot of the work that Ben Goldacre's done on Open Safely as well, who's spoken on these. So it's a kind of an open analyst community, trying to get things done quickly. The theme for today is, we thought we would pick one of the kind of big issues in healthcare at the moment and develop it. And we've already got some ideas beyond this, beyond today, is around patient flow. And we thought we would set the scene by having Clara talk a little bit about the problem. We work in Kent together. Who's in the wrong setting crudely? How do we get people moving around within that? How do we get more people into the correct setting to sort of set the scene of the problem? And what we also think is coming, we hope, and it's interesting, in the HSJ this week, they were saying that Steve Barclay's kind of start trying to protect all of the tech funding, because they are confident that things like the use of remote monitoring, things like the use of AI, and all sorts of things must be part of the solution in this. I think if we don't think it is, we're in trouble. So we are hoping that through the advent of a lot of new technology, we have done sessions on here on AI as well, actually, which is something we'll come back to. We think there are some really, really exciting opportunities around that. So Stephen is going to kindly sort of set the scene on remote monitoring as well. So the format of these, very active chat. Please put your comments, questions in the chat. Myself and Taz and Paul and Catherine and others will monitor that. Presentations from both of our speakers. Come back with any questions that you've got, not just for the speakers, but for each other. And then once the sessions are finished, and we will always make sure it's done within the hour, we will write the whole thing up, share it with you, publish it, and give links to all of the material that you've seen here without having to get to a more difficult site where it's quite well hidden. So everything that's on here will be on Twitter in a few hours with a link to a public-facing website. And this is being live streamed as well, just to make that point. Okay, so Clara, if you're okay to share, the floor is yours, and I'll monitor the chat and keep us to time.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk with you a bit today about the work that we've been doing in Kent and Medway on discharge planning and looking at models of demand and capacity planning within discharge pathways. Initially, when I was asked to get involved in this piece of work, the ask across the system was both to find a source of data to develop discharge PTLs, to be able to develop a operational monitoring of discharge demand, but also to source data that allows us to build demand and capacity forecasting and modeling. Across the system, as we started putting this piece of work together, we found that individual trusts tend to have designed their own discharge PTLs. And to create a system-wide one, we have 4 acute trusts in Kent and Medway, and a wide range of community services as well. To create a single model for the purpose of PTL or operational management hasn't been achievable as of yet, but we did need to find a way to look at system-wide demand. In the end, what we decided was to use the SITREP data that's submitted by acute and community services to try to build that demand and capacity modeling. That's the only piece of data that's consistent across all providers, but it does have some weaknesses. It doesn't include any of the demand on, say, for example, pathway 1 care in the home that comes from either front door services or some of our smaller providers that aren't included in either acute or community SITREP submissions. So there are some weaknesses to what we've done here with this modeling. And in addition to that, out of our 3 community providers, only 2 of them are actually getting data into the Southeast region. And the community provider SITREP has been changed significantly back and forth over the past couple of years. So the history in that data set wasn't as good. So just to give you that caveat, what we are doing with everything I'm going to show you in this presentation is just at acute level. But that is the bulk of our problem in the system. So as far as being able to look at the scope of the problem and try to identify some of the solutions, I think there's an inherent focus in data that sometimes you just have to make the best of what you have and work with it rather than constantly seeking to find the most complete picture. So I hope that's kind of a general principle agreement here that while this isn't a perfect solution, we do need to crack on and get working on trying to find solutions to the problem with the data that we have at our disposal. Some of you may know that the discharge SITREP is going to be transitioning into actually being a patient record level data set, which will be really good and will really help to improve this. That's probably going to be coming sometime in the course of this business year. So for now, we're looking at a weekly level data set that we're receiving. We also had some challenges with the fact that NHSEI doesn't make this SITREP data available to ICBs through our DISCRO, but we ended up linking up with Health Insights that NHSE, the Southeast region, have worked with, and they were able to load the data to us and help us work on building a demand and capacity model. So that product is what I'm going to be showing you, some of the work that we've done with Health Insights, and I'll show you a bit of a live demo of what we've done with them. So one of the things that we needed to look at within the system is just the growth that we've been seeing in the patients who are no longer fit to reside but are still in beds at midnight. And as Mark mentioned, there's a lot of differential between how we identify a patient who's no longer fit to reside. And so there may be some questions that come up in the group. Every trust has different views on how accurate the data that they're submitting actually is. So bear in mind that if your system doesn't have confidence in this data, it may not be as relevant to you. But where we have been using the data in some of the systems within East Kent, within Kent and Medway, I've selected to show you here East Kent's data because they do have the most consistent reporting out of all of our providers. So apologies to East Kent, I've just put that data in here just as a demo. So you can see in this data that the number of patients who are not fit to reside has been growing quite significantly over the course of the past couple of years. just in recent months, we've started to see this turn in the right direction and start to tip back into a better position. I've also got here the proportion of those patients as a bed percentage. So we can see that that data has been growing, that the number of patients not fit has been growing. You can also look at the length of stay in the system, and you can see that that increase in length of stay has been growing in the corresponding trend to the number of patients who aren't fit to reside. One of the issues we found as we've dug into the data is that growth in the length of stay has made a significant difference to the way that we used to operationally manage our discharge pathways. In the previous period before COVID hit, we were averaging around 6 days length of stay. As long as we're under a week on our length of stay, we can potentially have days where we don't manage to discharge as many people as come into the system. And that tends to be on the weekends. We quite frequently would see that on the weekends, discharges would drop quite significantly. But as long as the average length of stay was staying under 7 days, you could sort of mop that up at the end of the week or throughout the course of the week. But as we saw some significant shifts in days on end where that differential between incoming and outgoing was being breached for multiple days on end and in significant volumes, that tipped us over and we went beyond 7 days. You can see this jump here where we started to breach 7 days. And after that period, the length of stay just grew exponentially. We've been able to monitor our total discharges, and a lot of people would focus in the past on kind of looking at averages. On average, is our demand meeting is our capacity meeting our demand? And what we found is that on average we do, by and large, across the system, but it's that daily breaching that's causing the problem. So looking at the data through Lightfoot, we are able to actually pull out that daily differential between what's coming in and what's going out, and take note of where those breaches are happening and how large those breaches are. So as I mentioned, as we went past that kind of 6-day length of stay, we started to see that those breaches, even when they were just small, even just a couple of patients on one day, beyond what was coming into the system, starts to stack, and that stack just starts to grow, and that length of, and that number of patients who are waiting just continues, that backlog continues to grow. So working with Lightfoot, we've created a tool, and this is the tool I'll show you live in just a second, where we can play in some different scenarios into the tool on what we would need to do to increase different pathways, levels of discharges, and to focus on potentially what would happen if we focused on longer stay patients versus shorter stay patients, to see if those different cohorts of patients would actually help us to clear the backlog faster. And when we play around with this tool and try to factor in different changes, we need to look at what we're aiming to achieve. And so given that the discharge data has only been flowing since early COVID, the best we can get as far as a baseline of what good looks like and what we're aiming to get back to is to look at this data historically all the way back to the beginning of the SITREP initiating. And we can see that there was a period of time that was relatively flat where that growth wasn't happening. So that's what we're aiming to come back to as a period of what appears to have been a stable maintenance level position. So using that historic data, we can say this is what we think we can manage as a level of backlog that is sustainable. Anything beyond that, you can see that the trends start to grow. So I'll just flip really quickly into the actual Lightfoot tool itself, Health Insights tool, and show you a bit about how it works. So in this viewer here, you can see our history. And just to talk you
Clara, we've still got the PowerPoint on, if that's what you...
Okay, I'm gonna have to stop sharing and reshare. So.
Yeah, you might, exactly.
Share screen. Should be this one.
That's it, perfect.
see the live viewer?
Yep, got it.
So there's a few nuances to the discharge SITREP that we've had to work around. We've had to kind of really dig into the SITREP to understand what data it's showing us and how we can use it. They have information broken down to patients who are waiting 7 days and patients who are waiting 14 days. The 7-day is obviously the larger cohort, and that would be something that we prefer to look at because it's nearly all of the patients who are waiting. But unfortunately, that piece of data has only been submitted for a short period of time. The 14 days has been submitted since the very beginning. So I kind of toggle between which one I look at depending on what I want to do with it. So we would look at the 7 days length of stay if we want to see what is close to the total number of patients waiting. So this is very nearly 100% of the people who are waiting. So we can look at this to say, what is our current backlog? Our current backlog is around 180. But if we want to look at what did history look like, what was a good level to say this was where things were stable, we're going to have to look at the 14 days because that allows us to see further back in history. So when we look at the 14+ day length of stay all the way back to the beginning of the COVID period, you can see where those stable levels were sitting, but that isn't as clear when you look at the 7-day length of stay. So within this model, we can look at various different pieces of information at different levels to help us answer different questions. But the tool that we designed with Lightfoot to model what we need to change is this one here. And in the slide deck that I'll share with you, I've got links to all of these models. So anyone across the Southeast system can use these. I'm afraid it's only modeled for the Southeast. Within this viewer, I'll try zooming in a little bit so that I can show you what it does. This breaks down pathways 1, 2, and 3. And then the final view here shows you the total, inclusive of those who aren't yet designated as to whether they're waiting for pathway 1, 2, or 3. It's not necessarily an indication that they're waiting for a pathway 0. They may just not have their pathway defined yet. I probably should step back a little bit and make sure I explain what pathway 1, 2, and 3, and 0 mean for anyone who's not as familiar. Pathway 1 is patients who are being discharged home to have some sort of support in the home. Pathway 2 is patients who are being discharged, most likely to a community hospital for rehabilitation services. Pathway 3 is patients who are being discharged to a longer-term placement to a care home, for example. And then pathway 0 would be patients discharged home with no further support or packages of care required. So within the data set that we're looking at, in order to define what the incoming patients were, because that actually isn't included in the SITREP, unfortunately, we've had to look at that growing backlog and use the growing backlog as an indicator of how many more patients were coming in than were going out. Because obviously, wherever that backlog is growing, that's an indication that there were more coming in than going out. So this top section here is a calculated field that tells us how many patients were coming in based on that growth in the backlog. The bottom section here is an actual count of the patients who were discharged within that pathway. And this is the growth in that backlog. One thing that needs to be kind of shown here is that the range, the scale of this graphic doesn't go all the way to 0. So some people were looking at it the other day and thinking that this line suggested they were coming down towards 0, but it actually doesn't go all the way down. So it's just a little note so that people don't misread it. And the boxes here are indicative of your kind of rolling average. You can adjust your rolling average in this top section of the tool. And the reason for that adjustment is that if you are seeing in your system a really stark recent change, either a worsening position or an improving position in recent weeks, then you can adjust the way that it's forecasting and the way that it's calculating your averages to take that into account. So in this case, you can see that in East Kent, there has been a recent dip in the backlog. There's been a recent improvement. So rather than looking all the way back at the past year, for example, which would be selecting 52 weeks, which shows you a really dramatic rise based on histories. This one's saying if you were doing what you were doing historically, you would see significant growth here. But we're going to tell it to recalculate based on our current behavior because things have changed. And it can show you that currently you're roughly leveled off. There's slight growth happening, but you're certainly not quite going to clear the backlog carrying on doing things the way you're doing. So you do need to factor in some improvement here if you want to see this backlog actually come all the way down to a target position. So as I said before, if you want to look at what you think your target position could be, you can look at your history and say we were relatively level and flat when we were, let me just pick off of here. We were in a relatively level and flat position when we were around 40 discharges, around 40 patients waiting per day. We can manage that level and stay relatively flat. So we want to see this come down to about 40 discharges a day in a best case scenario. So we play with our adjustment tools up here and say, we're going to adjust the number of discharges we're managing. We could also adjust the length of stay. So if we say we want to bring our discharges up by about 35% in the under 21 lengths of stay, and we want to bring our discharges up to about 35% in the over 25 lengths of stay. Go. Then you can see that that forecast is telling you that you can get down to a stable backlog position of about 40 patients if you look at about a 35% increase in pathway 1. So that's how the tool works. You agree as a system what you think your target should be. You play with these factors until you get to that position, and that tells you what level of improvement you need to put in place to meet that target. So in this case, we're looking at in East Kent, we need to see about a 35% increase in capacity in pathway 1 to achieve a stable position. Now, again, that's just with acute care. That doesn't factor in backlogs in community. That doesn't factor in any plans you might have to address discharges at, not discharges, but taking people out at the front door before they even get into a bed. So there are more components here that people do need to factor in, but I think this is a pretty useful methodology as long as your data is fairly consistent and you're pretty happy that the data is relatively accurate. It's a pretty good tool to factor in what you think you need to transform in order to improve your discharge pathways. So we've been using this in Kent and Medway as a means of putting together both our Better Care Fund planning to work through our winter planning and to set system targets for improving discharge flow. I'm going to stop sharing now and take questions from the group.
Thank you, Clara. That was brilliant. And thank you for sort of catching up on some of the jargon as well, because there's quite a lot of, I felt like the translator for a little bit. And some people know a lot of this, and some people might not be as familiar with those terms, like not fit to reside and sit reps even.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's some quite interesting, there's a lot of questions come through. There's a sort of an overall theme. Jake, do you want to come off mute? I mean, I think the point that seems to be coming out in the chat a little bit is you're describing kind of what's going on without going into why it's going on potentially. So as a layperson, you might look at some of those length of stay, those numbers of people trapped for more than 14 days and ask why that hasn't just reset back to kind of where it was. And there's some stuff there in the chat, but Jake, did you want to come in on your question about process and capacity?
Yeah, I just think that sometimes the received wisdom is the easiest wisdom, which is we don't have enough beds, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough time. we don't have enough resources, which is the quickest consensual answer to every problem in healthcare, it seems to me. And of course, it's partly bound to be partly true. You know, it's always bound to be partly true. But the question is, unless you can precisely define how true it is, then we're never going to get to the end of this problem. So my point, which is, I think these are really fantastically useful guides to asking questions, but the questions stop in a meeting with people where everyone has an opinion and everyone tends to agree, well, we've got too much demand and not enough supply. My point is, unless you get into the next level of detail, which is what are the processes that you are using to discharge patients and how are you measuring those? And is everyone doing it in the same way? You never get to a resource question, which is actually really, really important because, you know, the Treasury always says that the NHS always says that it needs more money, and they don't seem to give a good enough account of themselves about what they are doing to ameliorate this issue. So I think that's my basic question, which isn't really directed at you, Clara, because I think it's just a broader question for the analytical community, which is, you know, more and more better and better analysis of what's going wrong is not enough. And I think there's a great opportunity to say, okay, why is it not going right? How are we doing at the moment? What is the inefficiency in the system? And I would say lack of standardization is a massive part of that. We assume we will have standardized clinical approaches about most things, but when it comes to the administration of healthcare, we have wildly different processes and very little capturing in digital form of those processes.
Thanks, Jake. Clara, if you want to come back on that, or Geeta's point in the chat about why things haven't reset. I'm just interested in your, you know, people like you and I kind of working as analysts, how often we get into that softer stuff. So do you feel, are you spending a lot of your time, if you look at it simply, doing what you've just shown us? And how much of your time are you considering some of the stuff that Geeta's talking about in there, which is kind of why these things are going on? So
I think there has been a lot of talk about the resource available, particularly social care, and the resource available for patients being discharged to home who need support. And one of the things that we've had discussions around in collaboration with some of our finance colleagues is that there's inconsistency in how services are commissioned as well. And I think that trying to be as tactful as I can in the way I phrase this, I think that there's some wildly different cost models, different types of service models out there. And there certainly is a discussion across the systems that some services are losing staff to other services that are able to offer different opportunities to staff based on different cost models and different contract models. So I think you were talking a bit about consistency in how we discharge people, but I think there's a need for consistency in how we commission the services that are going to allow those patients to be discharged. So I think that that's one of the key conversations we're having in Kenton Medway is about how we can change that commissioning model and commission jointly with our social care colleagues as well, and make sure that we are tackling that that push and pull of the same resource we have across the system. If we can ensure that they're all providing the same models of care that are required and they're all paying their staff the same way, then they should be able to retain their staff at the same level, and we don't have, you know, services popping from one side to the other and not being consistent in their availability to us to use as a resource. So I think that that's definitely a conversation we have quite a lot. I've brought to you particularly just this issue of how we pull data out of the system, but that is what is being done with the data. That's the kind of contracting debate that's going on, and this is the data that's hopefully feeding that contracting debate.
yeah, on the consistency point, Clara, because a lot of this, what this group is for, is to try and make analysis comparable across different regions. So let's all call COVID the same thing, or frailty, or dementia. The stuff that you've done with Lightfoot, does that roll easily out of Kent into Sussex and Surrey?
So, yes, so the
Anything?
data that's in the Lightfoot tool, I keep being told to make sure to call it Health Insights because Lightfoot is the provider of the tool, but it's Health Insights for NHS England South East. They do hold data for every provider in the Southeast region. And while a couple of these tools I built myself for my teams, they're all available on the platform, and I've made sure that the drop-down boxes include everyone, so I can share them with everyone, even though they were designed particularly for some services I was working with in East Kent. So the data's in there for all of the Southeast region. But when it comes to consistency of the reporting, even within Kent and Medway, we have different trusts who use different PAS systems. And there are definitely challenges with trusts that don't use the same PAS systems, definitely identifying patients in the same way. So for example, we have one organization that has to pull all of their discharge data manually from clinicians every morning, whereas others are actually using the data put into the PAS system to be able to pull this data out. So there's obviously some real disparities there just between trusts. One thing that NHS England nationally is doing is that they're completely revising how this data is collected. So it will be collected on a patient level basis, but every trust needs to be able to identify the discharge ready date, and how that is defined is going to be really important. Just to give a quick example, we've had debates across a couple different providers about, do you calculate the number of days from which the patient was first discharged ready? Because what happens in practice is a patient becomes ready for discharge, but they can't be discharged. They wait days, weeks, they deteriorate. Now they're not discharge ready anymore because they've deteriorated, and then they become unready, and then they might become ready again. So there could be multiple days and ways of counting that. So that has to be agreed nationally, and trusts right now are putting in place the systems on their PASs to be able to count that discharge ready date, and hopefully come to a consensus where they're all doing it the same way, and then it'll be available to us at a record level, and then we'll be able to do so much more with it because we could link that patient into other systems, be able to find out more information about the patient's waiting at a pseudo level, obviously. So when that record level data set comes in, it'll be more consistent, it'll be more reliable, and hopefully we can do a lot more with it.
Really interesting. Thank you again, Clara. There's lots more going on in the chat, so if you've got a bit of time, maybe go off and respond to some of those. Okay, I'm going to move us on. One of the things I mentioned at the beginning was kind of greater use of technology around some of this. So is the big sort of white hope is could we have more people being monitored outside of hospital as opposed to sat in a hospital bed with various monitoring going on there? Would that allow us to discharge more quickly? Would it allow us to set up virtual wards, the hospital at home type model? And Stephen very kindly from City Council in Leeds is going to talk a little bit about what they're doing. I'm sure, as with Clara, that will prompt a whole load of discussion. So over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen there. Okay, first of all, just to by way of introduction, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephen Blackburn. I work for Leeds City Council, but just a little bit of background as to why I would possibly get involved in remote monitoring. We've gone through a bit of a restructure recently, and our IT service within the council has merged with that of the Leeds office of the West Yorkshire ICB, what was the Leeds CCG. So our two IT services are working together, and we have now staff working side by side, if you like, covering services both across Leeds, both across sort of traditional council services, but also primary care as well. So I have to say this, and because I'm from the council background, the whole healthcare stuff and primary care is all quite new to me. So a learning curve as we go, trying to learn all the acronyms and all the boards that people don't tell you about that we have to find out for ourselves. So it's very much a learning curve is this project, but very interesting all the same. And really just for those of you that are please forgive me if I'm preaching to the converted, but or trying to get you to suck eggs. But the technology that we're talking about here for remote monitoring is essentially the same as for virtual wards, just in a different setting. So whereas virtual wards, the use of technology is about how do we get people out of hospital quicker to be able to monitor them back in their own home or their care setting. This is what we're talking about here today is not getting you to hospital in the first place. So we received £110,000 of NHS England funding for remote monitoring. This is the last tranche of money in this area. So there's no further funding to do this type of work. So it's kind of being wound down elsewhere. So this is the last bit of piloting of the technology. And like I say, we're looking at it from a primary care setting. So it's about managing those people, who have 3+ long-term conditions, who are maybe regularly attending their GP practice, their GP surgery. And it's about trying to free up those GP appointments so that perhaps they don't need to attend quite so often, and hopefully to avoid hospital avoidance as well more often, so that they never end up there because they're being monitored on a more regular basis than they even could be done by attending their GP practice. Like I say, it's about improving capacity for clinicians who are delivering services. We all know how difficult it is to get an appointment and ringing up at 8 o'clock in the morning and being on hold for an hour. And it's about freeing up that capacity really within our GP practices. It's about managing conditions more effectively. And so we're more aware of patients' conditions on a regular and to some degree real-time basis. And then, of course, we can adapt the medication that patients get and can improve medication management for those patients. We are trialling this project with up to around 120 patients. Like I've said, it's supporting those with 3+ long-term conditions. In order to carry out effective evaluation, we are looking to ensure that all patients have at least one of those long-term conditions the same, so that we can evaluate across the board really. So we're looking at diabetes as our kind of LTC across the board, where all of those 120 patients have that, plus any other 2 long-term conditions. From their point of view, hopefully it will improve their quality of life, their health and well-being. They're not going into hospital quite so often. They're not having to go to their GP quite so often, and they'll be able to manage their condition more effectively in their own home, essentially. In respect of the delivery of this work, we will be working closely with our 100% digital Leeds team. Now, for those of you that are unaware of that particular team, that program, this is our digital inclusion program in Leeds, and they work already closely with third sector organisations, community groups who are embedded within various communities across Leeds, and we will be working very closely with them to support patients in the community who might struggle with technology, who might not know how to use that. People will be given tablets, they'll be given mobile phones, they'll be given equipment. So we need to support them right from the outset, and we'll be working with our networks to be able to deliver that. Of course, it's really important that whatever we do, we do it in the right way. And as you'll imagine, we need to be really clued up in terms of the governance and the clinical pathways and get everything signed off. We're working very closely with the Long-Term Condition Board in Leeds. Now, they're working across 3 PCN areas. That's Seacroft, West Leeds, and BHR, which is Bermontoffs, Hare Hills, and Richmond Hill, and we've split the monitoring across those 3 cohorts. Though across those 3 PCNs, though I'll come back to that in just a moment, because some things happened this week that we need to have a rethink about. It will be. We've created a clinical reference group, so there are GPs on that group, and we have a lead pharmacist who chairs that group. So we have clinicians who are really aware from a patient point of view that we're ensuring that we're ticking all the right boxes as we go through. And we have meetings with suppliers, with the 2 suppliers, which I'll come on to in just a moment, in the next couple of weeks, to go through the clinical pathway. So obviously there are clinical pathways that exist already, but what we need to consider is, how does the introduction of this new technology change that pathway? And to ensure that we're getting that signed off, and to ensure that, whatever we do it in the right way. One thing I will say about this, because we had our kickoff session a few weeks ago, and people said, well, what about, what happens on a weekend, or what happens on an evening out of hours? We need to be really clear about this. This is about supporting existing pathways. It's about supporting GPs. So GPs, if they're not there on a weekend and they're not there on the evening, this isn't a replacement for that to give 24/7 support. It's about supporting GPs when they are available. If somebody has a heart attack, or they suspect something's, going seriously wrong out of hours, then they would do exactly what they would do normally, i.e. they'd ring 999, 111, whatever they would do. They will not, and we'll be really impressing, on patients about this. Do not assume, just because you've got some monitors in your house, that somebody at the other end is actually looking at those readings 24/7. It's about supporting you in a way, from a GP perspective, so that you maybe don't need to go to your GP quite so often. And it's not about being a 24/7 support for you, and don't expect an ambulance to come when it certainly won't be coming. So it's really important to mention that. In terms of the approvals of those pathways, we'll be going through the CareMe group in Leeds, and also approval at the long-term condition board that I mentioned. And in terms of evaluating the project sort of more broadly, we're working closely with the Yorkshire and Humber Academic Health Science Network, who are doing that independent assessment for us, working with us right throughout the project, and then doing that evaluation report at the end. Just a little bit now on the a couple of solutions that we're trialing. So we're working with MyCare, who they're a bit different to the other one in that they're kind of using a lot of voice and sound. So that little cube you can see there is kind of like a little Alexa. So you can ask it questions about, if you've got any concerns, and it will give you some, some feedback on that, and might be able to support you in that way. It also listens to how you're walking, so it can it can look at your gait and whether you are walking in a slightly different way over a period of time, if you start shuffling more or whatever, and then that can be reported back to GPs. Also coupled with other technology, other wearable devices, sensors such as blood pressure monitoring cuffs, that kind of thing, and then that data is fed back through the app there that the customer has, and can be picked up at the other end on the dashboard by the GP. Now, this is the change that we need to still iron out. So we were due to work with 40 patients in the Seacroft PCN on this one, but unfortunately, Seacroft are unable to work with us on this as a last minute thing. So we need to work out where those 40 patients we're going to work with. So that's not quite accurate, but we'll be looking to work out where we can work with those patients elsewhere. We're also working in the BHR, Bermondsey Hales and Richmond Hill PCN, and 20 patients there. As you'll see on the next slide, BHR are also working with the other solution as well. So they have 20 patients also on the other solution. So we just need to work out where the MyCare patients are going elsewhere from Seacroft. Like I say, it works on voice and sound. Their box is called Monica. And I mentioned about the data collection and the use of other sensors. Lucy, on the other hand, this is an Apple dedicated solution. They'll be working with 40 patients in the West Leeds PCN, and then the other 20 patients that I mentioned in BHR. Again, they use different monitors, different wearable devices and sensors. They don't have a voice solution on this, so it's about that data feeding through their solution and then through to a different dashboard at the GP practice. There are different programs that support up to 100 different conditions, and depending on your long-term condition, you load or you download those applications, those programs into the Lucy device, and then it tells you what to collect and all the rest of it. And of course, with the patients, they will have different long-term conditions, and we will be providing different patients with different sensors, different wearable devices, dependent on their long-term condition. And that's the work that we'll be doing over the next month or so with GPs to identify who those 40, who those 20 patients are, get those patients signed up, and then be able to deliver that equipment to them and get them onboarded, if you like. I think I've covered everything on that one. In terms of timeline then, and where we're currently at, we're currently doing the GP onboarding and working out those pathways. Like I said, a couple of meetings over the next couple of weeks with the suppliers, because the pathways may be different depending on the GP practice, will be different perhaps dependent on the technology that we're using, might be different depending on the long-term condition. So lots of different permutations there that we need to work through. The patient onboarding, we hope to sign people up over the summer months, July and August. At the same time, we'll be getting those pathways approved, so that hopefully come September, October, we've got the pathways approved by the LTC and CareMe boards, and then we can start to get patients onboarded in terms of using the equipment through September and October, and begin the monitoring. The monitoring will be completed, will take place over the sort of winter, spring months. So we'll get a good variation there, I think, and see if the temperature makes any difference. The project will complete, and that is pretty much a hard stop. So if we delayed in delivering or rolling out those monitors, then it means that the project is slightly shorter, perhaps, or certainly that's the thinking at this stage. So the monitoring will be completed in June 24, and then over July, August next year, all completed, all done and dusted by August next year, when the AHSN will have finalised their report for us. Just to say, the AHSN have done some work already in this area in terms of virtual wards and in terms of remote monitoring, sort of from a primary care perspective as well. So they've got some good background knowledge already. However, what they did say is when this type of technology was rolled out previously, it was done within COVID, and it was kind of rushed out a little bit. It was just, well, you can't come to the practice, so here, use this stuff, not necessarily thought through, and so perhaps wasn't deployed in the best way in some cases. So I think it's good that we're working with the AHSN, because then we can build on some of the best practice, or perhaps not so much, on the work that's been done before. And just also to mention as well, whilst this is a pilot project, whilst we are only working with 120 patients, we are very much looking at this from a perspective of how would we actually deliver this at scale, so that come sort of July, August next year, we are seriously considering how we roll this out. Like I say, there's no further government funding in terms of trialing the technology. I think, in fact, I think I saw something briefly on the news this morning about Steve Barclay mentioning, in terms of this kind of technology, they say it's it's been tested, to its limits really. If you're going to use it, start to use it, and that's really the focus now. So, and that's the focus that we'll be looking at here, that we will be trialing it with a view to how do we scale this in earnest going forward. So that's about all I want to say. Sorry, I've talked probably a little bit longer than I wanted, I intended to at least, but there, I'm on LinkedIn if you want to connect, or stephen.blackburn@leeds.gov.uk if you want to drop me a line there. All right. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Stephen. Really, really interesting. And it's interesting that the questions that you're getting in the chat, which, might not all be for you and you might not want to answer all of them, and Graham might chip in and answer some of them, is around things like cultural competency, who's being chosen for this. I think there's two themes of questions. How are you picking the people to try this out on? So are you going to the poorest people first, or people from a particular ethnic community that don't speak English or wouldn't be used to having smartphone, or, how have you picked the population group to try? And how does that link to the evaluation that the HSN are going to do? And is there a control group and so on? And the second sort of set of questions that I'd be interested in is all of those data that you imply that's going up to cloud, and some of it's local on Apple. Where's all that data going? Is there a research and planning opportunity there, a linked data set that you might be building out in Kent, where someone is gathering all of that data together and thinking, oh, there's a pattern here. People like this behave a bit like this. So the next time we'll do that. Let's take the first one first.
So let's answer those. So the first one, number one, the patients haven't been identified yet. That's the first thing. So we're working across those 3 PCN areas because those, the long-term condition board have been doing work in those 3 PCN areas already. Okay. I will say that those are some of the most deprived neighbourhoods and wards in Leeds, and therefore a lot of sort of Leeds City Council work is focused in those areas anyway. So that's the reason why we're working in those 3 PCN areas, because we're piggybacking on other work that's already been done. But I think that they are the right areas to work in, and we probably would have chosen those the wards that fit within those PCN areas anyway. And then it will be a case of working with the GPs to identify who are the right patients, and we will be guided by GPs, to be honest with you, who we would work with. Certainly, in terms of the cohorts of people that have 3+ long-term conditions, so it's about narrowing down to those that have 3+ LTCs. It's then about narrowing that down further to those that have diabetes plus 2 other LTCs, and then working that out from there. And we will be guided, if I'm being honest with you, by the GP practices on who the best people would be to work with. I think there is something, I have to say, about working with those who struggle with technology, if I'm being honest with you, because I think if we can make it work for those people, then I think we can make it work for everyone else who less struggles with technology. So I think there is something there, and that's why we're working very closely with our digital inclusion colleagues to ensure that we're able to do that. I hope that answers that question. That's probably as much as I can offer on that one. In respect of the data side, we've recently created a Leeds Office of Data Analytics, headed up by our new Chief Data Officer, Richard Irvine, who comes from NHS Digital originally. He's been in post about a year or so now, and any data that we are allowed to share, pseudonymized, anonymized, however that works out, will be shared with the Leeds Office of Data Analytics to again look, read more into that data, what can be gleaned from that data in terms of population health, perhaps, and be able to do some additional analysis over and above really that that this project is focused on. So that is something that we're already looking into as well. And I did just spot very quickly something in the chat. I'm sorry, I put about Steve Barclay. Somebody asked a question. Have I got the link? No, I don't. I think it was just something that was mentioned on BBC Breakfast or something this morning in passing. So there's just something that's stuck there in my head. So sorry, I don't have the link. I think it was just mentioned this morning.
No, that's all right. I can get that. Because that popped up in HSJ earlier this week. I think he'd come out and made a specific statement so that the tech stuff would get protected. So we'll get a link and we'll kind of wash up after this. So don't worry about that. I think that was Alicia. That's fine. I did say I'd finish this on time. And I always think we might run out of time and we never do. Because people go, I'm sorry to hear someone's got long COVID as well. Facebook's good for long COVID, I think. Right, I'm going to let you go because we're out of time. We will thank you very much for coming, everyone. Thanks in particular to Clara and Stephen. Fantastic session as usual. We will publish. We'll contact you all afterwards, and we will publish the list of. Well, we'll publish this one, but we'll also publish to you and your network the future events that we've got coming up as well. So we're doing quite a bit of work on analyst development, as I said. We're coming back to virtual wards and coming back to inequalities again over the summer and later in the year. So thank you all very much and keep in touch. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.